Well, I'm back in the hot tub, and today I'm talking to Christopher. Christopher is self-identified Catholic. He's in his mid-30s. He's well-to-do. He has a very good job, and he travels quite a bit. He seems worldly, which generally puts him on the progressive side of the spectrum, but as it pertains to his politics, specifically his view on human rights, he's incredibly conservative. Well, we were sitting there in the hot tub, and he started talking about abortion. He started explaining to me that he didn't think that women had the right to murder the unborn. Specifically, he didn't want his money, his tax dollars, to be spent either for contraception or any medical attention to women, and that included abortion. But it was also specifically abortion. He took special time to explain that part of it. When I questioned him on this and said, well, what about people that get pregnant by accident? And he said, well, that's a tiny percentage of people. I said, what about people that are raped? He said, that's a tiny percentage of people. I said, incest? And he said, that's a tiny percentage of people. I said, what about women whose lives are in danger due to the pregnancy? He said, this is a tiny percentage of people. I said, you know, at some point, these percentages start to add up to some real numbers. He told me that it's something like 99.99999% of pregnancies are totally fine. They're none of the things that I brought up. And I said, it's probably not that high. I said, I think mortality rate for women is probably much, much higher than you think it is. Women die in pregnancy pretty often. And I said, historically, something like 20% of all women died giving birth. And he kind of looked at me queerly and he said, what do you mean historically? I said, look back for hundreds of thousands of years, for millions of years in our evolutionary path, something like 1 in 5 women died during pregnancy, either giving birth or during the pregnancy itself. And he said, well, I don't get it. What does that have to do with modern pregnancy? I said, the trajectory is to have women survive, not to increase the likelihood that they're going to die. I said, not having access to medical care during a pregnancy very much increases their likelihood of dying and reverts us back to our pre-medicine, pre-technology age. He sort of scoffed at this. I don't think he liked what it implied, but I don't think he also believed what I was saying. One of his responses was particularly telling, especially as it relates to conservatism. He said, well, they just shouldn't get pregnant. So here's a conservative denying medical attention to pregnant people, denying contraception to all people, a staunch Catholic, saying, well, just don't get pregnant. Like that's an option. Like that's any option that anybody's had in the history of mankind. When I said to him, and this was probably the most baffled I've ever seen him, I said, you make it sound like women have a choice. And he said, well, they do. And I said, no, they don't. Women don't choose to be women. They don't choose to be the version of our species that gets pregnant. They didn't choose to be women any more than you chose to have your testicles on the outside of your body in a soft, fleshy, kickable sack. I said, I'm sure you would prefer that your testicles were in something a little more armored, like a turtle shell or something, but they're not. You didn't choose that, so don't get kicked in the balls. And he looked at me like he didn't understand at all what I was saying. I said, women don't choose to be the one that gets pregnant. They don't choose to lust after men. They don't choose to biologically want to breed or to be a species that requires sex. They don't choose any of this. The only choice women have ever had is one that was provided by science and advancements in technology and medicine. Essentially, the advancement of the scientific method. What you're describing sounds archaic and horrible and inhumane because it is. It's hearkening back to before we knew anything about anything. You're saying essentially just let God deal with it. If you die, then you die. It was your dumbass that got pregnant. But women don't choose any of that. And they especially can't make that choice if you deny them medical care and deny them contraception. Well, that hit home. He looked down and he thought about it. He crossed his arms and he tried to recapture some essence of dignity and humanity. And he said, well, gee, you're pretty progressive then, huh? You think all of us should have to pay for that? So now he's trying to switch this to ad hominem. Now I'm some sort of weirdo progressive who thinks that women should have a right to their bodily autonomy and their bodies. And of course, that puts me, I don't know, in some category of people worth ridicule. I said, let's not change the subject. I said, do you really think that women choose to get pregnant? Or do you think that they fall in love, they have sex, which is something all people do, and then sometimes they get pregnant, and sometimes they don't? Not only did they not choose to be women, that's just what they are, but they didn't choose to have this happen. They didn't choose to have this acts of love, an expression of affection and emotion and passion and making love. They didn't choose for that to be how they get pregnant either. They also didn't choose the fact that they have an incredibly strong sex drive. They didn't choose to be attracted to men. Lots of women are attracted to women. They're not attracted to men. They didn't choose that either. I said, how could you possibly blame them? You're like, basically what you're saying is, well, just don't be a woman. And again, he looked down and he crossed his arms and he looked a little bit defeated. He had a furrowed brow and he was just trying to grasp onto any humanity that he might have. He couldn't muster anything else to say. He was flummoxed, dumbfounded. He did say, I've never heard anybody talk about it like this before. I said, well, that's interesting, I guess. I think after being silent for a little while, I finally sort of let him off the hook and started talking about something else, or I sort of changed the subject to say, well, why shouldn't we offer them medical care? Why shouldn't a woman be able to decide whether or not something lives inside her body? And then he just reverted back to, well, she chose to get pregnant. I said, I thought we already covered this ground. He said, yeah, I guess we did. And then he bowed out. He said, well, I have to go. But this level of conservative stupidity and ignorance, this blaming a woman for being a woman as if she had some choice in the matter, this redirecting the spotlight onto her as if she's the one to point the finger at, as if she's the one to be held accountable for this, her situation. Now, as a progressive, I do recognize that she has some level of accountability, but she didn't choose to be a woman and she didn't choose to be the version of human that gets pregnant. The only choices she had before her were ones given to her by science and the scientific method. There was no Catholic doctrine and there was no verse in the Bible that gave her the ability to choose whether or not she got pregnant. It's a little bit ironic and pretty sick and twisted that a Catholic sits there and says, well, you can't have contraception and you can't have medical care, and you chose this. You chose to get pregnant. She didn't choose any of it. And she doesn't get to choose, according to a conservative and a Catholic, whether or not that unborn person inside of her takes precedent over her life. I think if conservatives and Catholics had their way, they would just extract the baby as soon as it was viable outside of the womb and discard the corpse of its mother. I know that they're known for being very supportive of their wives and so on, as they say things like, well, she can't divorce me, we're Catholic, and stuff like that. But blaming women for the fact that they're women is a little bit like blaming men for being men. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. None of it does. The facts of the matter, the science demonstrates that when men and women come together and make love, that sometimes babies are the product. Sometimes little people. I'm fine with calling them little people. In fact, all the science demonstrates that they are a Homo sapiens in some stage of development. I have no problem giving the unborn all of the human rights and bodily autonomy rights of all people, just like I have no problem giving somebody in a vegetative state who is late in their life and perhaps living off of machines bodily autonomy rights. But to suggest in any way that any person, or any, I should say, Homo sapiens, has a right to use another person's body for any purpose against their will and without their consent, that's very clearly inhumane. It's very clearly a violation of human rights. We can demonstrate that we have a right to bodily autonomy if we look to the definition of what biological life is. We can readily and easily derive a right to bodily autonomy. I must breathe. Therefore, I must have a right to breathe. I must eat. Therefore, I must have a right to control what goes into my body. I must excrete or pass or poop, if you like. Therefore, I must find homeostasis. Therefore, I must be able to control that which goes into and comes out of my body and when, for the most part, to the best of my ability. That is part of being alive. It's to seek out that which we must, and we must breathe. So we must seek out clean air. We must eat and drink, and so we must seek out water and food, and we must find homeostasis. Therefore, we must move things through our bodies and metabolize. We don't have any choices in this matter. It's something we must do. But with all of these must-dos, these rights, because what is a right if it's not something that I have to do? I have no choice, of course, and therefore it must be my right. And it's further an example of a right and a demonstration of a right that if you took away any of those, if you took away my ability to breathe or my ability to eat or whatever, I would suffer horribly and eventually I would die, the ultimate suffering. This must be a right of mine because taking it away causes suffering, ensuring that I have this right causes flourishing, and by the way, I have no other choice as a living creature. Now, procreation is very similar to eating and drinking and so on as far as the definition of biological life is concerned, metabolizing, all these things, response to stimuli, and so on. These are all part of the definition of life. Procreation is a little bit different, though, isn't it? Because as someone who gets to control my body, I have the right to bodily autonomy. I can look at the definition of life and derive that right. But I have to admit that I must stop and consider procreation separately because it does require that two people come together for that act. When I drink water, I don't need another person, but when I procreate, I do. That's a fact of our evolution. We inherited this from those that came before us. We had no say in this. It is our right to procreate with whom we wish, but both parties must be on the same page. Both parties must give consent. And any violation of that consent is a violation of human right. It's a violation of my right or your right or the human right of bodily autonomy. That's as simple as if I wanted to keep my finger in your ear. Let's say I want to put my finger in your ear. You would have to consent to that. And if I wanted to keep it there for any length of time, you would have to consent to that. And if I didn't want to take it out, you'd have to consent to that. And even if you consented to all of this and you said, well, this is indefinite, you'd still have to consent minute by minute, second by second to this agreement. And the moment you stopped consenting, the moment you said, I no longer want your finger in my ear, I would be in violation of your right to bodily autonomy. And I'm a human being. I'm a Homo sapiens. Now, the unborn is the same. They're a Homo sapiens. They're a human being. They have this right to bodily autonomy. And while they don't ask the pregnant person if they can live inside of them, there is consent given by the pregnant person. And as soon as that consent is withheld, as soon as the pregnant person decides for any reason that they don't want this other person inside of them anymore, then they have the right to have that person taken out. And the fact that an unborn person may die during this process is not the pregnant person's fault. It's not humanity's fault that unborn people require another body, another person for them to live. It's not the unborn's fault. It's not the pregnant person's fault. It's not the doctor's fault. It's not humanity's fault. This is just how it happens. Now, the only way to relieve the pressure is through science and medicine and advancements in science and medicine. It didn't come from the Bible. It didn't come from the Quran. It didn't come from the Hadith. It didn't come from any of the Jewish texts. There was no relief for women before science and medicine. The only relief we get from any of this turmoil, from any of this conversation, any of this argument I was having with this person in the hot tub is science. It didn't come from anywhere else. And the only solution is science. If I was a Catholic conservative like this person, I would be dumping all of my money, all of the Catholic money possible into inventing a womb outside of a woman's body, an external womb. Take the whole process out of a woman's body. create a process through science, through technology, and through the advancements of science and technology so that all of your Catholic babies live and all of your Catholic mothers live, and there is no conflict. Now, there is such a thing as an exterior womb. Scientists have invented such a thing. I wonder if Catholics and conservatives will ever get on board as to funding the advancement of that technology and figuring out how to incorporate it so that abortion is a conversation that we don't even have anymore. Now, Catholics and conservatives are incapable of progress. That's why they still talk about condoms and contraception as an evil. They can't progress because that's not what the Bible says. That's not what the Pope says either. But do realize, as a progressive, the only relief from this conundrum, the only relief that you're ever going to get from the decision of whether to murder the unborn who lives inside of you or someone you love, is going to be through science. It's going to be through the advancements of science and technology to make that not even a decision you will ever have to make. It's very similar to the advancements in contraception. We don't even have conversations that we used to have because we have condoms. We have birth control. We have IUDs. We have the day after pill. We have all these different things at our disposal that science gave us. Eventually, we will have an external uterus. That technology is evolving. It is being developed. Where's the $1 billion from the Catholic Church to solve our abortion problems? Where's that $1 billion that they should be investing in having this abortion problem that they're so worried about be completely null and void? It won't come from the Catholic Church, I'll tell you that. Conservatives pretend to care about the unborn and they pretend to care about mothers and women, but immediately when you ask them, well, what should be done? They just say, hey, just don't be a woman. Just don't be a woman. That's the solution. How do conservatives ever expect to get past these problems if we don't incorporate science, if we don't accept science? If Catholics are still concerned about contraception, how are they ever going to get to an external uterus? I think that's about it for this episode.